Right now we got two great minds here to talk about how what we started here is going worldwide. John Conroy has been my friend for many years, and he has been an incredible force of reform in Canada, helping Rene Bourget, helping in this new case that's trying to save the medical program in Canada. All the way along, he's been steadfast, the guy to go to if you got a big Canadian case. And we got Mike Krawitz, and Mike's been one of my inspirations for many years. A veteran injured in the service. He has been an advocate for veterans for, since he got out. This cannabis thing has been his mainstay, but there's been a lot of other veterans' rights issues. It used to be that you go to the VA for help needing pain medications. They made you sign a pain contract that you wouldn't use medical cannabis, even if you lived in a state that allowed it. And Mike and many other veterans got together state by state by state, and on the national level, they're turning this around. They're turning around the whole perception that marijuana is bad for us psychologically, and making the state legislatures and health boards around the country understand that this is an important cure for PTSD, and the veterans deserve this. We put them in harm. We have to get over the idea of taking away something that could help them. So John and Michael, take your time, explain what you're doing. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael's got one more thing that he's doing that he's really here for today, which is that he has been the American most participating in the discussions, mostly out of Europe, of what's going on with the UN. And every 10 years, the UN has to have a drug summit, or 20 years? 10 years. They have to have a drug summit. It's coming up next year. And he's going to tell you about the organizing that's being done around the world to get the UN to get out of the drug war on marijuana and other drugs. So you two take your time. I'm going to take a quick break. Just take the stage for 10 minutes. Yeah. Tell us what you're doing and what you think's important.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, given the topic, world domination, I think I'll first say a little bit about international issues that have come to my attention and so on, but I'd like to address some of those issues that came up on that last panel, because that's the critical legal issues that I see at the moment, are this whole business of how do you regulate dispensaries and compassion clubs in the context of selling medicine to the public from the lawyer perspective. But let me come back to that. Most of my involvement with international law has actually been more to do with imprisonment. I've been practicing law since 1972. I practice in Abbotsford, BC, which is surrounded by federal prisons. And so I spent a lot of time acting on behalf of prisoners, doing habeas corpus and parole hearings and all sorts of things like that. And the international standards on the treatment of prisoners and all of these sorts of things were very big in the early days in terms of fighting prison cases and prison law. But in 1982, Canada became a constitutional democracy. Before that, we were a parliamentary democracy, and Parliament could basically do whatever it wanted. We had a Bill of Rights, but it was really meaningless. Any federal objective could override it. But we became a constitutional democracy in '82, and that's extremely important in terms of the legal context, because all of these international treaties that Canada enters into, or has entered into many years ago, are all subject to the Constitution. And another difference, a major difference between Canada and the US is, in the US, when you enter into a treaty, it's self-implementing. In Canada, you have to pass domestic legislation to implement the treaty. And of course, that domestic legislation is subject to the Constitution. It has to comply with the Constitution. So a lot of our litigation has been in the courts. And instead of spending time trying to convince the UN or other bodies to go along with what we propose, we've known that the governments have essentially been against us anyway, and the only way that we could beat them is to get a court to agree with us and strike down the legislation. So in back in the early, I would say, 90s, we took a case to the Supreme Court of Canada called, the person I represented was Randy Kane. It became known as Melmo Levine. And in 2003, the Supreme Court of Canada basically said, it's a political question. Legalization is up to Parliament. It's a political question. And basically, we've known since then that we've had to do politics. But in the medical area, it was established that the government had to provide reasonable access if you're medically approved. And that forced our government to create medical marijuana regulations which allowed people to grow for themselves or have a caregiver grow for them. And that was the model that existed for some 10 to 12 years in Canada. The government claimed lots of complaints from neighbors about smell, and there's certainly validity to do with that. They complained about public safety because of grow rips and these sorts of things. The evidence didn't support the extent to which they, of course, were making these claims. But in any event, it led to something called the Marijuana for Medical Purposes Regulations, which takes away a person's right to grow for themselves or have a caregiver grow for them. And so we went to court in a case called Allard, and we managed to get an injunction to keep people's ability to grow for themselves or have a caregiver grow for them, pending further order of the court. And we finally have completed, there was various appeals and all sorts of things that went on, but we finally have completed all of the arguments, and it's now in the hands of the judge, and we're hoping we'll get a decision within a few months. A big case came down from the Supreme Court of Canada, however, that related to what we were arguing, and that is also part of our actual arguments, and that is early on the government tried to limit possession to dried marijuana, so you couldn't possess any other form of cannabis. And our Supreme Court of Canada on June 19th eventually ruled that if you're medically approved, you can possess cannabis in any of its forms. So in Canada at the moment, throughout the country, that's the law. And that's another big difference between us and the US. Our criminal law is federal. Yours is individual states. So our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, now I know you have federal drug laws and so on as well, but our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act is a federal statute. And so the provinces don't have a role, direct role in that area. Tobacco has become a divided field. I discovered in doing the Allard case that you can still grow 15 kilograms of tobacco in your backyard for you and anybody over the age of 18 in Canada, as an exception, indoors or outdoors. So that's a divided field. We've got federal legislation, we've got provincial legislation, and then you have local governments that are creatures of the provincial legislatures or your state legislatures. And it's those local governments that are your cities, your municipalities. And so they're the ones that get involved in the local issues of dispensaries and compassion clubs and rules and regulations. But there's always higher federal and to sometimes provincial laws that come into play. And so where I'm leading to is if we succeed, and people are still able, patients are able to grow for themselves or have a caregiver grow for them, there's obviously still going to be all kinds of people who still want reasonable access and won't do it that way. The new model has these licensed producers who have had to go through all kinds of heavy security and all kinds of stuff. They're treating marijuana as if it was still the most dangerous narcotic, using all the old rules with special vaults and all the rest of it that you have to have. And so that's still left this gap in the middle. And so what do you do? And what's happened? Well, this is what we learned in the evidence in the Allard case. In Israel, they used to have all kinds of people growing for themselves, and then they went to a system where they've got about 5 major growers, and people have to go through them in order to get their product. They're phasing out individual ability to grow. Israel's great, though. They're way ahead of most countries. The governments, including the medical profession, the military, the police, everybody supports the medical marijuana program, and some of the best research is coming out of Israel. Then we heard about Holland. Well, what happened in Holland, as you know, they've had these coffee shops non-enforcement policy going back to '76. And so everybody would go to the coffee shops. And then the Dutch said, well, look at this. We've got some people who've set this thing up where you can go to a pharmacy, and they've got a couple of big growers that are growing what they call a medical product that's going through this pharmacy. And they've got about 10 to 14,000 people that are going there instead of just going to the coffee shop. So we should legalize it. Remember, they still have the non-enforcement policy. And non-enforcement policy allows you to grow 5 plants. If they find them, they'll take them away, but they won't bust you. So you can grow 5 plants for yourself, or you could go to the coffee shops, and people started going to these pharmacies. Or this, I think it was 1, maybe 2 pharmacies at best. Well, what happened when they legalized? Only 600 people signed up. And now, 12 years later, they got maybe 1,200 people signed up. Everybody voted with their feet and went back to the coffee shops. Why? Presumably because it was a lot easier to just go to a coffee shop and not have to go through other rules and regulations that you had to with the pharmacy. Part of it, though, as I understand it, is that the only major producer that qualified to be the producer in the new program was Bedrocan. And Bedrocan hasn't obviously produced a good enough quality, and the people turned around and voted and left. And Bedrocan tried to do a survey of the quality between the clubs and what was being produced officially. And sure, they found a little extra mold here and there and some samples, but basically it showed that people who run these clubs, or coffee shops in Holland, they don't want people to get sick either. They want to make sure their product is good as well. And so they're going to take precautions just like anybody trying to grow for themselves. But herein lies the dilemma. But let me first take you to Vancouver to illustrate again how this problem is arising. So in Vancouver, we've had the BC Compassion Club incorporated 18 years ago. And it's a member-based society that's been there before the medical marijuana regulations, before there was any supply in BC. And then there were maybe 5 other compassion clubs or so on, and some called themselves dispensaries that grew up. And so then in came the MMAR, the medical marijuana thing, so people could grow their own and so on, and the other history I told you about earlier. But what suddenly happened in Vancouver? After we've got these licensed producers, about 12, well, there's actually about 20 of them, not all of them can supply, and their prices are high, and lots of complaints about you can get it the first time, but then you're on a waiting list, and you can't get it the next time, you're strained, and so on and so forth. So people have voted with their feet in Vancouver as well, and we now have 140 dispensaries. We went from like 10 to 20 to 140 within the last 6 months. And so this caused the local government that controls zoning and usage to say, oh, well, we've turned a blind eye to this for all these years. We've allowed these things to happen. The police didn't want to be on the news taking away people's medicine and being accused of things like that, so they allowed this to happen. And now all of a sudden we're faced with this dilemma. They got the federal government saying, clamp down on them, bust them all, because they're the unprogressive conservatives. We've got the city saying, or the province basically saying nothing, although they've suggested, some of the powers that be in the province have suggested that they should let British Columbia have a Section 56 exemption of the law and use British Columbia, like the feds here have said Washington State and Colorado is sort of a model to see what happens. So we're in this situation where they've passed this bylaw to govern use, medical-related use. And they've just made a distinction between compassion clubs and dispensaries. The fee for a true compassion club is $1,000 a year. For a dispensary, it's $30,000 a year. You got to make sure you're not within 300 meters of a school or a community center or another dispensary. So all of these rules and regulations have come in. So this is what the problem or the dilemma that I'm seeing and hearing. You've got from our perspective internationally, Washington State, Colorado, Oregon, Alaska, District of Columbia, Massachusetts, when we hear these stories that these states have legalized, we hear about Uruguay, we hear about the other day, Colombia, you could grow 20 plants now illegally apparently in Colombia. So, you know, we've got this happening across the globe. When I started in this cause some 40 years ago, this wasn't happening. It was rolling the other way. And so I see the roll is on, and it's not going to be undone. They are not going to undo Colorado and Washington State and so on. It's going until we have full legalization across this country and hopefully in our country. Now, we've got an election on October 19th. We've got the Liberal Party of Canada saying they will legalize. We've got the Democrats saying they will decriminalize. That debate is still going on. That just, you know, should be put to bed a long time ago. And the progressive conservatives, well, they support some sort of a traffic ticket system, but really they'd like to increase the penalties if they could. So we've got this horrible split, and we're saying you've got to strategically vote and get rid of the unprogressive conservatives so that we can legalize in Canada, and then that would be across the country. Now, we'll probably have the same issues as you've got here. You're always going to have purists who want it to be perfect before you have that model in place. And unfortunately, as has been illustrated here, while there are lots of problems with what was passed here, particularly for medical folks, the perception internationally is legalization is happening. And part of the reason for that is because Washington State legalized. But everybody should, I hope, you know, forget about who was in what camp and so on and get back to realizing that we're still all in the same camp. It never was going to be perfect, I-502, nor, I'm sure, what just happened in Oregon, nor what we certainly not what we came up with for the medical rules and regulations in Canada. We spent years and years, the 10 years that medical marijuana was under the good regulations, we still spent all of those years going to court to try and undo restrictions that they had, where you could only grow for one person and not for two, where you could only have so many in one place. All of these, you know, the dried marijuana limit. These were all litigation things that we were doing during that whole period. And so obviously, the new regs here, you've got the same problem. You've got, you know, the doctor's form here in Washington State, which is structured in such a way that you're hardly ever going to get a doctor to sign it, and that's a problem. You know, so that's what been going on, and the information that I've been getting, you know, in terms of what's going on internationally indicates that the dispensary model, the Compassion Club model, seems to be needed to fill that gap between those who can grow for themselves or have a caregiver do so and those who can afford the big-time licensed producers. But this is the dilemma. You can grow your own vegetables. You can give them to your neighbor. You can take them down the farmer's market. Big store, well, you probably have to go through a bunch of rules and regulations before the big store. Certainly the big store is going to have to do a whole bunch of things before it can sell it to the public. So how about marijuana? Well, if you're going to grow marijuana for yourself, or you've got a caregiver growing it for you, that's one thing. But if you're going to grow it and call it medicine and sell it to the public in this day and age, you're going to have to expect that there's going to be all kinds of rules and regulations. So that is what I see as being part of the future fight, is to try and get them to understand and create a legal regime that enables dispensaries and compassion clubs to continue to exist. They don't have to have the high extent of rules and regulations that they impose even on the licensed producers. You know, they can have inspection systems that will protect the public insofar as the selling of a product to the public is concerned. So that's where I see us having to hopefully be able to look at other countries and see what they've come up with in order to try and grapple with that problem so that patients can access their medicine in a legal market. Again, Canada is a federal country. The Controlled Drugs and Substances Act is federal. Our Food and Drug Act is federal. If they legalize in Canada, they have to take it out of Schedule 2 to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and then it's legal. The federal government has then stopped using its criminal law power over cannabis. Immediately, the natural health care product regulations under our Food and Drugs Act will come into play insofar as marijuana for medical purposes. It will become, because it fits all the definitions of a natural health care product. Part of the problem has been getting people to stop looking at it like a pill or a regular approved drug pharmaceutical that has to go through all the double-blind placebo-based studies. It's a natural health care product, and it'll be regulated as a natural health care product for medical purposes, and for social or recreation purposes. There's going to be a huge issue between the federal government and the provincial government as to who gets control and who gets the taxes. That's what I see happening in Canada as we move towards a legalization model. So I don't know if that, I can always carry on for a while, as any lawyer could, but let me give Mike some time.
Thank you, John. I guess I should just introduce myself first. Hello, everybody. Michael Krawitz, Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. And it's a real honor to be on this panel right now with just the three of us at the moment. Donnie is one of my mentors and a great friend. And John here actually is really kind of an interesting person from my perspective, because we're 1 degree separate on 50 different projects. But we've never actually sat on a podium together or worked together, I think, on an actual project together. So this is a rather unique and first experience for us to be on a panel together, and I really appreciate that. Meaning that, I want to say nothing happens in a vacuum, and what we've accomplished here in drug policy reform in the United States has definitely been on the not on the back so much, but very much informed by the process over in the Netherlands and the process in Canada. And without that mentoring, I'm quite sure we wouldn't be where we are right now. So, even though right now, in some ways we've surpassed Canada, and now Canada is kind of trying to catch back up, and the same thing with Netherlands. Don't forget that, this is a give, take, push, pull, and this relationship is very, very productive and meaningful, I think, for both sides. So, good starting point. This is the wrong page, right? Of course. I wanted to read the title of this panel, the World Domination, Legalization on a Global Scale. I just love that title, so I wanted to revisit it. World Domination, Legalization on a Global Scale. I guess overgrow the government, like our friend Mark Emery would say, to the great extreme. And I guess to bring this story back to a kind of an easy starting point, I want to tell you all why I started working on international policy. Another mentor floating around here, Chris Conrad, actually got me into the mood, if you will, opened my eyes to another way of looking at the world. He was over working with the Green Prisoners Amsterdam, and they had a thing called the Drugs Peace House. And participating in that process, and we're trying to fight the extradition of Les and Cheryl Mooring back to the United States. We're trying to keep them in Amsterdam, where they didn't face 10 or 15 years for growing a handful of marijuana plants back in Indiana. And when I got back to the United States, I started looking at marijuana policy, but I started looking at it from an international perspective. And the real crystalline moment for me, I think, was the point where I found, and I discovered in our own United States Constitution, where it states something along the lines of treaties once ratified become the supreme law of the land. And what that means, in essence, over the years I've been taught, is that means that once we sign onto a treaty and it's fully adopted, which is a very long process, it goes to the states and everything. Once we do that and we accept a treaty, it actually has the status of federal law in the United States. And if you dig a little deeper, which I did, and you studied Anslinger and you've been a student of Jack Herer's work, as I am and as a lot of you are, you'll know that the marijuana law, the Marijuana Tax Act, was found unconstitutional. Timothy Leary won his court case. It's so overshadowed by the bullshit that came afterwards that we forget that Timothy Leary did win, and the Marijuana Tax Act went down in flames as unconstitutional. What they replaced it with, the Federal Controlled Substances Act, is a little bit of wizardry, because it uses the federal law aspect of the constitutional aspect of the international treaty as part of its fundamental legal foundation. And it's woven through both ways. The treaty is in some ways a model based on our law, because we have treaties subsequent to our law. Our law was passed in 1970, and we have a new treaty in 1960, 1970, and 1980. So we actually have treaties that were written after our law that were based on our law. We have our law based on the treaty. It's woven through there. And often you hear about the jurisdiction of our federal law. That's what the marijuana cases at the Supreme Court were really all about. Can you claim a medical necessity argument as a club? Most importantly to this conversation, can the federal government say that you can't use medical marijuana when it's just inside a state? And that is the jurisdiction of the federal law, which we've now heard so many times covers every inch of the United States. That's where the federal government can enforce its law, is everywhere in the United States. But you never really hear about a case going at the true fundamental constitutional authority by which they prohibit marijuana in the first place. That's what these guys did in Canada. Hopefully, at some point, we may actually get there in the United States and look at the fundamental constitutional right to access cannabis. But for right now, where we're at is this treaty actually has been unchallenged in the federal circles. And right now, we are still subscribers to the international treaty and go and root for this treaty in the international bodies. And the fascinating thing about this is the perception out there, and it's rightly so, is that treaties really don't matter too much in the United States. The United States federal government can care less about treaties when they seem to impose any restriction we don't like. And the people get that. The people at the state level who represent us get that. The federal government, who actually should be watching these treaties, the Senate and stuff, aren't paying attention at all, that I can tell, really. And it leaves this vacuum under which the international bodies are basically unchallenged. And up until very recently, we really hadn't challenged on marijuana at all. I'm really, really heartened by what I see. Where we're at right now is a kind of a crossroads, where we're gonna find out the countries that are legalizing marijuana, Uruguay, United States, etc., are going to the international bodies. I've been there to witness this. And they say to the international bodies, which when I say international body, I'm talking about, don't look at the UN as a thing here. It's not, the UN isn't a thing here. The UN is just a place with regard to this. There's other parts of the UN system where the UN does act like a thing, and there's blue hats, and there's security councils and stuff. But when it comes to drugs, it's just a club. It's just a place where Russia, China, United States, and a few others hang out and tell the rest of the world what to do. Very directly. They don't even have a committee. It's much more pure in the drug circles. And I'm telling you that right now, these governments are going to this body, including China, breathing down our neck, prohibitionist country that they are. And we're telling them, no, this is well within the flexibility of the treaty to experiment with policy, including legalization. Now, we, Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, went to our Assistant Secretary of the State Department, Brownfield, and actually told him, we don't like that. We don't like, that's basically to us is, we're doing it because we can argument. And as veterans, we're like, we know why you're doing this. We're doing this because the United States Constitution is preventing you from stopping us. So you might as well go to the UN bodies and say, the Constitution of the United States drives us to do this. And as my esteemed colleague said, that's really the terms at the UN. If your constitution of your country dictates a behavior, That's what floats. The treaty doesn't trump that. So we're at a very interesting crossroads where China, the United Nations system itself, the International Narcotics Control Board, doesn't really like this idea that we're putting forward with flexibility. And I'll leave you one last thought on that. The flexibility argument that was presented by Uruguay at the United Nations General Assembly in New York just recently was an absolute showstopper. And they said, hey, death penalty isn't called for in the treaty. If you're going to have death penalty for drugs, that's in the flexibility of the application of the treaty. And if you're going to be using the flexibility of the treaty to allow you to have death penalty, then I think our having legalization should be certainly tolerable and seen in that light. And that's an argument for you. That's one that, yeah, you just don't top it. Whoever writes for the Uruguay deserves a real good ribbon for that.